This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we will talk with our guest, who we introduced to you in a previous episode, about the concept of one voice of quality. And we had a great conversation where we really had a chance to lay out the ramifications of failure to change, not only in the post-approval change process, but the mindset around the implementation of a global regulatory framework. And on this episode today, we'll provide greater details for more understanding around the hows and the whos that are necessary to this one voice of quality vision. So with us again to do that is Emma Ramnarine. So welcome back, Emma.
Thank you, Stacey. Glad to be here for part two.
Yes, so glad to have you again. Such an important topic, very timely as things are unfolding as we speak. So, Emma, for the benefit of our new listeners, can you just start off with a very brief overview of what we covered in episode 1?
Yes. So really, in our first episode, we talked about why this is a wicked problem, why we call drug shortages a wicked problem, what attributes make it a wicked problem, and the challenge that global complexity brings in terms of taking years to implement changes that drive continual improvement and innovation. So really, we laid out the problem, why it is a problem, and then we touched briefly on the one voice of quality effort and what areas are being addressed by the one voice of quality effort. So hopefully today we can dig a little bit further into what these actual solutions are and what is being done and where people can engage further in the dialogue.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. That's a great overview. And expanding on then that specific one voice of quality concept, who, Emma, specifically needs to be involved in realizing the solutions here for this?
Yes. So in our first episode, we talked about what it is, and it's really about the chief quality officers and quality leaders from 20 plus global pharma companies that have decided to speak with a unified voice and develop standard solutions that use enhanced science and risk-based approach. And what those science and risk-based approach is going to do is really allow for more effective management of post-approval changes in a company's quality system, as opposed to submitting them through prior approvals. So really downgrading the changes, reducing the burden of making post-approval changes is what we talked about. And the goal is very much around ensuring that we're able to implement changes much faster, and two, that there are fewer changes that require prior approval before you implement them. So the solutions are supposed to be very practical. They're supposed to be tangible. We're providing clear steps, tools, templates that companies can apply to very specific post-approval change examples. So the concepts have all been laid out, and now we're trying to really bring this down to the ground floor and say, how do we actually implement it? So there's quite a bit in terms of these solutions, and we can talk a little bit more about them. But the biggest one in here, I would say, is the standard science and risk-based approach. So it's a decision tree that walks you through each of the steps. And then there is the second aspect around how do you actually demonstrate that your quality system is good enough to allow these changes to be handled without being submitted for prior approval. It's all fully aligned with the ICH-Q12 concepts, and the intention of really making these changes practical is for us to be able to implement them in real life. So who should be involved within companies? I would say quality functions, regulatory functions, operations functions, quality system. And then the other stakeholder group that really needs to engage on this and has been engaged is regulators. And by regulators, I mean both reviewers and inspectors. And the reason I say this is because reviewers end up reviewing the changes and assessing the changes that companies submit. But inspectors are really the ones that review your quality system and say how good it is and is it really effective. So inspectors need to be able to say if your quality system is effective and capable of handling more changes in the PQS. So those are sort of the players that need to be involved, Stacey.
Sure. And so this is so we talk about the regulators, and obviously we're trying to streamline this whole, the value in this concept is that we're really streamlining this process. So not every change needs a formal approval by however many regulatory agencies are there, globally. And so when we do that, we're talking about, Emma, having a one-time review to ensure that your processes and protocols are what they expect, what the regulator would expect, and based on that, going forward, then under the one voice concept, you would then obviously be pre-approved.
Yeah.
Excellent. I just wanted to clarify that a little bit, because I know it sounds like in the concept, when you're speaking of it conceptually, you really can hear the streamline or see the streamline. But as we bring regulators into the key personnel list here, I just wanted to clarify that a little bit so that people did understand that it's kind of a one-time upfront go round with them, and then going forward, they have less involvement in the day-to-day approval piece. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Sorry about my dog back there,
That's
but okay. But I also think fundamentally it comes down, Stacey, to say, how do you earn the trust, and what is it that you can demonstrate that you are able to handle this streamlined approach within your company's quality system? So it's easier said than done. Right.
Absolutely. That's what I mean. It's the concept seems to make perfect sense. So now we're talking about the application in real practice. So as mentioned previously, this whole concept is really a mindset shift, as much as it is a process change, right? And so the big question then, under current guidelines, how can a company be trusted to make the post-approval change decisions that today reside with the regulatory agencies? So if you could expand on that, I know you touched on it a little bit, but if we can expand on that more so we really have a good understanding of how this kind of plays out up front.
Yeah. So, right. This is just as much about a mindset change as it is about process change, Stacey. So science and data utilizing the latest product and process knowledge have really got to be the basis of it, right? So what this means is that the same post-approval change can have different outcomes in terms of regulatory filing based on the level of product and process knowledge and risk control. So let's say a change to a excipient for a particular product, right? Let's take that as a change. Company A has a really good quality system and they have really good product and process controls, really good knowledge around it. So they should be able to downgrade it and manage only in the quality system or as a notification. But company B, this is a new process, new excipient. They don't know very much about it. They haven't done their risk, or their quality system doesn't have all the controls identified. Well, it's the very same change that will need to be filed. So now you're moving away from this black and white of saying it's an excipient change, so it doesn't matter which company, everybody has to file it for prior approval. So from a mindset standpoint, what this means is regulators will also need to be able to be open to accept that the reporting category does not need to be the same across the board for a post-approval change, right? So this needs to consider the company's product and process knowledge and the effectiveness of their quality system, as I said. And where this is adequate, they would need to accept that a change does not need to be submitted as a prior approval, but can be downgraded to a notification or even further managed only in the quality system. Inspectors then can verify during inspections that this is indeed happening and that the quality system is effective in managing these changes. So conceptually, it all sounds pretty easy and straightforward.
Right.
But more work is really needed because the maturity in the use of enhanced risk-based application within the industry has still some room for improvement. I would also be remiss if I do not mention that the varying levels of national and regional requirements also represent a hurdle, because there will be instances where a post-approval change has excellent knowledge bases, the company has a great quality system, yet the change must be submitted. So this is where the one voice of quality papers that are being developed for the specific type of change examples, and they're being published as the industry position on how that type of change can be downgraded from a prior approval, those will be very, very useful. So these examples are available on the One Voice of Quality website, and we'll provide the link of the website along with this podcast. So companies can really use these industry position papers to support downgrading of their changes based on their knowledge.
That's great. Yeah. And we do definitely want to have some follow-up information for folks, because this is a new concept. One that is being embraced, though, pretty well by parts of the industry. I can't wait to hear more about how you're going to get all of the regulators globally to hop on this train. But that's part of the process here. So, Emma, you mentioned science and risk-based. And so what exactly are you talking about when you say enhanced science and risk-based approaches for the post-approval change process?
Yeah, so Stacey, in part one of this podcast, we talked about the need to create a reliable risk-based decision-making process,
right,
where we are today in terms of that risk-based decision-making and what more is needed. So I won't go into the details of that, but what I'll reiterate is that, yes, QRM application and use of risk assessment tools has certainly improved for companies and regulators. However, the science and the databases for these risk assessments and the resulting decisions is still quite weak. So we can do better in utilizing the latest product and process knowledge, current risk controls, and strength of the PQS to support this decision-making. The question becomes how. So the fundamental basis of an enhanced science and risk-based approach is that it shifts us from a country-specific and a one-size-fits-all approach to an approach where your specific knowledge and risk controls are the ones that are helping you get that flexibility and faster global implementation. So it basically will enable the alignment between first company and regulators. And then also the hope is among regulators, because the scientific basis for a change remains the same, right, regardless of the country or the filing geography, right? So what an enhanced science and risk-based approach would mean that as a first step, the company performs the risk assessment using their latest product and process knowledge. And based on that risk assessment, they propose the change category for that particular post-approval change. The next step would be what I call a level 1 calibration and alignment between the company and the regulator, sure, to say, okay, this is the risk level and the filing category you proposed makes sense or does not make sense. And that's an opportunity for a calibration. And eventually what I call the level 2 calibration and alignment, where it is now between different country assessors. We're starting to look for alignment in the understanding and acceptance of the risk level and understanding and acceptance of the categorization and implementation. So the what part is clear for all of us. ICHQ 12 has laid out the concepts. The One Voice of Quality effort is providing the how now in terms of the examples. And now we really need to start doing the hard work of globally implementing this science and risk-based approach across industry and across regulators.
Yeah, for sure. But it's exciting. Emma, I want to talk a little bit more about knowledge, because you've you've mentioned it several times already, that it's important based on the amount of knowledge that you've been able to amass as a company. that obviously weighs in the amount of autonomy that we're speaking about here in terms of this process. So to me, knowledge management and quality risk management are key, or seem to be key here. So why are these two things, knowledge management and quality risk management, so important to the PQS? And what else is essential to demonstrating an effective PQS? Because you're talking about, that these companies need to demonstrate this up front. So talk about what's important here with these concepts, if you will.
But now you're coming to the nuts and bolts of it, right?
Exactly.
So knowledge management and quality risk management are called the enablers in ICH Q10. And they are called enablers because they facilitate the achievement of the three main objectives of Q10. One, product realization. Two, maintaining a state of control. And three, facilitating continual improvement. They do this by providing the means for the science and risk-based decisions that are needed to be made for product quality. So ICH Q10 also states that regulatory approaches for a specific product or a manufacturing facility should be commensurate with the level of product and process understanding, the level of quality risk management, and the effectiveness of the PQS. So it's stated very clearly in ICH Q10 that these are the basis to get the regulatory flexibility. I would say that besides the two enablers, there are four elements to your question around what else is needed in the quality system to work effectively. And these are the elements of CAPA, change management, management review, and process performance and product quality management. So the Q10 guidance describes these elements and enablers of the quality system. And back in 2008, it said when implemented, these can be evaluated during regulatory inspections at the manufacturing site. However, after 2008 and the Q10 guidance, there really has been no guidance or specific details provided in Q10 or other regulatory documents for companies or inspectors on how to measure or demonstrate the effectiveness of these elements and enablers. So that's why the One Voice of Quality paper that was published in July and August 2020, and we've provided the link on the website and also with the podcast, it describes the how behind these four elements and the two enablers, how that can be specifically demonstrated to gain the regulatory flexibility and benefits of faster innovation and continual improvement. So specifically, the paper goes into this solution around these four elements and enablers, and it shows how the quality system should, one, capture the trigger and the signals for these changes and for corrective and preventive actions. Two, how it should manage these within the quality system. And three, how do you verify them for effectiveness? So it's gone into more specifics around how do you actually do this. Right. Additionally, I mentioned the PICS paper that was published on how to demonstrate effectiveness of the change management system. So I would really encourage our listeners to take a look at both the One Voice of Quality and the PICS paper and implement them in your companies, because these provide you the roadmap for the how behind demonstrating the effective management and the how to gain the regulatory flexibility. It becomes, when you apply these, it gives you the means to have a really robust dialogue with regulators.
Right. And this is right. So we will include links in the show notes again to those two articles, as they are important for companies to move forward with this concept. So and you've made headway. I mean, this whole One Voice of Quality concept has really progressed very quickly, I would say. Well, at least it seems to be from my perspective. I know you've spent a lot of time on it, working on it. What are the next steps then, Emma, in developing a standardized approach to effective management of post-approval changes in a PQS, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So, Stacey, I would say the concepts and the standard approach have been developed and published. The next step is really their implementation. So companies can do this in a three-pronged way, I would say. The first prong is at the individual post-approval change level. Implement the risk-based decision tree for every post-approval change that you're making. The One Voice of Quality paper provides the stepwise guidance on how to use this decision tree. And additionally, there are the post-approval change examples that are being published, so you can use those within companies. The second prong, I would say, is at the PQS level, so at the quality system level. And that's how do you demonstrate the effectiveness? And again, the paper provides how you can actually do that during inspections. And then the third prong, which is this multi-stakeholder collaboration level, this is going to be continuing. There has to be this active dialogue and collaboration within the industry and also with both reviewers and inspectors to ensure the success of these implementation. And I would say though these discussions emphasize the role of quality in ensuring that post-approval changes are being effectively managed, this can be specifically highlighted with inspectors during inspections. And at the same time, on the reviewer side, we should be thinking about how can we move towards harmonized global filings and global categorization of changes. This is where the regulatory functions within companies can really engage in that dialogue with regulators, specifically the assessors. So we really need to, in this third prong around advancing the dialogue with regulators, have to do so with both assessors and inspectors. And this is a much needed component of the implementation to be successful. Because like I talked in my earlier podcast, the industry cannot do much to make this happen by themselves, and the regulators cannot do this by themselves. So we've really got to start bringing these together.
Yeah, it's really a team effort. And do you have a timeline in mind for this? You know, what is your thought on that? Like, how long before we start to see this really being implemented?
So I think starting at the change level, we can start doing that now.
Right.
And in terms of countries like the US, Europe, the advanced ICH countries are already doing this in some cases. But the benefit, your bigger question is around when will we start realizing the benefit of this? I think that is a ways to come, Stacey, because until we start seeing this change at a global level, you can start moving the needle at a change by change level,
right?
But the macro level, that overall ambition of getting a transformation will take a couple of years.
And that makes sense. You know, we are a very slow moving industry, historically anyway. So I would not expect everybody to come running, right away. But this makes so much sense, this concept. And it really is going to make everybody's work easier when it's fully implemented. So to me, it seems like there is definitely a motivator for all parties to really, move through this sooner rather than later. Emma, so operating under a risk-based approach to the product lifecycle, which we've talked about, the team then that's involved in this should be aware of risk levels and prioritization that are needed for the post-approval changes. And therefore, they should be equipped to decide which specific post-approval change related performance indicators are going to be implemented, which are going to be tracked and acted upon by the company. So can you give us some examples of how you really envision this playing out?
Yes. So one, I would say that managing more post-approval changes in the quality system or via notification pathways clearly means that first companies should have some indicators that they're able to do this effectively, right? So that's the first part, because the goal is going to be that these indicators should ensure that, one, there are no unintended consequences or increased risk to product quality or patient safety because of the change being managed in the quality system only. And second, that the decision-making should be transparent it should be science and risk-based, and that there are both feedback and feed-forward mechanisms that are triggered by these indicators. So some examples that I can give for knowledge management, right? One indicator would be how much time does it take to implement new knowledge? Actual versus planned through the appropriate post-approval change initiatives. This would be a way of understanding the ability of a company to implement new knowledge in a timely manner, right? On risk management, another indicator could be number of quality and compliance risks that are open because we have not been able to make the post-approval change because of the complexity of right? So that's another indicator. Another indirect one would be number of drug shortages that are caused by delayed approvals for a post-approval change in a specified time period. And this is really to enable the mindset and the behavior that post-approval changes are being moved through faster when they're addressing a particular risk, and that these post-approval changes are effective in addressing those risks. For the change management system, an indicator could be what percentage of change records for post-approval changes have been open for greater than 6 months. Right? So how long is it taking us to implement this change? From a regulatory submission standpoint, we can see how many post-approval changes have switched over from prior approval to being managed in the quality system or by notification. So this would give us an indication, are we moving the needle in being faster and managing more in our quality system? Another one could be number of health authorities that continue to require prior approval submission for certain changes versus health authorities that are accepting the risk-based assessment to downgrade the change. So these are all indicators that will tell us, are we making a difference? And our hope is we're having this dialogue right now in One Voice of Quality, and some of this work for what indicators would be useful and helpful will be published in a guidance that comes out in the next couple of months.
Excellent, excellent. So we're talking about the indicators, and which means obviously then we are monitoring, we are tracking time and outcomes. So are there specific tools that exist or that need to be created that can really be used not only by the company but also by the inspectors and really evaluating the effectiveness of the company's PQS in relation to risk-based change management?
Yeah. So I would say in terms of existing tools that a lot of companies do management review. They do their quality system review, right? So the question would be asking the quality system review that you do, does that already include some of these indicators? And if they don't, then could it be considered to include these additional indicators within the quality system management review that companies currently do? In terms of change management, since you asked that one specifically, yes, the PICS paper on how to evaluate and demonstrate effectiveness of the quality system was published last November. My understanding is that the intent is to move it from the draft to the accepted PICS guidance date, hopefully by the end of this year. It integrates the principles of change management that are both in Q10 and Q12, and it provides a very practical tool and guidance on how to demonstrate that your change management system is indeed risk-based and you're making the appropriate decisions and that the change management system is effective. It is in the form of a checklist tool, not to undermine the value by making it a checklist tool, but it really does walk you through all steps of the change management or change control process to say, look for these things in your change proposal, in your change risk assessment, in your change planning and implementation, and in your change review and effectiveness steps. It was written as intended for inspectors, but it can be very well applied by companies. In fact, it'll help align industry and inspectors on what specific evidence can demonstrate that a company's change management system is effective. Companies, the One Voice of Quality companies, have recently completed an assessment against this PICS guidance to see our level of maturity. And I would say on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being world-class. Most companies are falling in the 2 to 3 range.
Okay.
So this is also a really good measure to say, hey, this is where we have gaps within our companies. And if this is the expectation, then what do we need to do to address and mitigate that gap? So clearly the expectations are laid out, and the paper can also help identify companies what they could do to mitigate the gaps.
Thank you. So here we are. I'm thinking about risk management, and you're talking about companies being at maybe a 2 to a 3 out of 5. And we're in the midst of a pandemic, and the COVID-19 crisis really has only heightened, the need for this global regulatory approach that we're talking about. And obviously this is not a new problem, but it's definitely one that we are thinking about even more so. And we've been working toward a more agile, reliable, and efficient manufacturing sector for, more than 2 decades. Where do you think we are in our journey then on that integrated approach to risk management?
Yeah, we touched on this just a bit in our first podcast, Stacey, but I would say you're right. We started this journey almost 20 years ago when Dr. Woodcock put out the vision for the 21st century manufacturing, which stated a maximally efficient, agile, flexible pharmaceutical manufacturing sector that reliably produces high quality drugs without extensive regulatory oversight.
Right.
That was 20 years ago. Then the ICH guidance series of Q8, Q9, Q10, Q11, and Q12 have now been published from 2005 through now, 2020.
Right.
So all the concepts are there, and we've made progress incrementally, but I would say not nearly enough. We definitely haven't realized that vision of an efficient, flexible, agile manufacturing sector, or that vision of doing so without extensive regulatory oversight. So continual improvement and innovation is definitely desired. It's even expected. But the question is it sufficiently incentivized? That's a
good question.
Sufficiently incentivized for companies to be moving in that direction fast. Demonstrating the product and process understanding and using your quality system is a big step forward in this direction, but we still have a ways to go. So the awareness has increased. The appetite for risk-based approaches is gradually improving. Now we're at the time of implementation of these approaches and acceptance of the resulting risk-based decision. That has to increase. So a crisis like COVID-19, as you say, has led to creative solutions to prevent shortages. And I do hope we retain some of these solutions, not only as a means to prevent shortages or to avoid a crisis, but also as a way to drive innovation and continual improvement.
Yes, I would definitely agree. And so implementation then, where do you think we are as an industry on with that? Really, I know that the risk-based approach is definitely widely accepted, in the pharmaceutical sector now. But as you mentioned, companies are in differing stages, right, of really implementing that fully. So if thinking about the industry globally, how well are we doing right now?
I think we're all over the range, right? I would say it's a spread. I hope to see the spread getting tighter, and that's why whenever we come together and implement consistently, whenever we come together and implement standard ways of doing things, and regulators are starting to see the same things across different companies, I think we can make that spread much tighter than it is today. Yeah. So we have started the journey, but I think we have more to do.
And I think, this is part of it, having these conversations and really reminding people of some of these concepts and encouraging them to move forward, whatever that looks like for them. Is part of this process, and hopefully it will just move the needle a little bit each time. Well, it's been great to have you again and to really lay this out in a little bit more detail, this whole one voice of quality concept. before I let you go, as we wrap up today, I just want to see if there's any closing thoughts or, final ideas that you really like to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, I do, Stacey. I would say we are really at the tipping point now of putting these concepts and standard approaches into action and really bringing them to life. We cannot let them remain only in black and white print. I applaud all the work from regulators and industry that has brought us to this point, but the harder part really starts now. We still need to continue to raise global awareness of the issues. There's still a need for multiple stakeholder groups to come to the table. There's still a need for science and risk-based decision-making to become the means to overcome our boundaries and constraints. And as I've said, no single stakeholder can do it by themselves. So if we haven't yet started feeling a call to action, we really should now. And I would say we have the components, we have the players, we have the game plan, and this year has underscored that the time is really now. So we really need to start playing together as one team to win this game, because we're going to be winning it for patients.
That's right. That's right. And it is all about the team effort here. So I appreciate you taking some time with us today, Emma. It's been a pleasure learning more myself about this whole concept and really just providing some good resources for our listeners. So thank you again.
Thank you, Stacey.
I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, I'd love to hear from you about that. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really do appreciate the help getting the word out there. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, you can visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great discussion. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.